Welcome back to Unit 5, Lesson 3. This is part 2 of the video, and it's optional unless you've missed class. And we're now going to talk about how the electrical signal actually works. And to understand that, we have to have some basic background. So, to create a signal, electrical signal, the cell must first create what is called a potential difference. And this is abbreviated PD. Of charges across the axon's plasma membrane. And sometimes when they're speaking specifically about the axon's plasma membrane, they abbreviate it and just call it the axomembrane. So what is a potential difference? If you have some physics background, you'll find this a little easier, but if not, don't worry, we'll be able to understand it with a little practice. So potential difference is a voltage difference, which is measured in millivolts. So I'll put the little symbol here for millivolts, MV, across the membrane. Created by the unequal distribution of blank. Okay, it's an electrical difference across the membrane. Well, what do we know that have charges in the cell? If you said ions, you are correct. So there's an unequal distribution of ions across the membrane that basically stores the potential for creating an electrical current. Okay, I'm going to tell you about various potential differences in numbers, and to understand that, we have to know what the potential difference numbers actually mean. And it refers to the relative charge or ion concentration of the inside versus the outside. So it's always talking about inside versus outside. Okay. So if you have a potential difference number that is positive, so a positive potential difference, what this means, there are more positive ions inside the neuron / axon portion of the neuron than outside. Now the interesting thing is, when we talk about negative potential difference, we're really not talking about negative ions. We're just talking about the relative number of positives. So negative potential difference means, still referring to the positive, there are less positive ions inside the neuron or axon than outside. So whether we're talking positive or negative potential difference, we're really just talking about where are there more positive ions. If there's more positives inside, it's a positive potential difference. If there's less positives inside, it's a negative potential difference. Okay? And that potential difference is setting up the situation where we can cause an electrical current to travel very quickly down the neuron. So if you find that a little bit confusing, maybe we can help you out with a diagram here. And I've set up the diagram at the bottom, and there's different important parts to the diagram. The first important part is this structure here. This is called a sodium Na+ / potassium pump. It's a pump because it requires energy, ATP dependent, to actually set up the gradient. And it sets up the potential difference by pumping three sodium ions out for every, I should put out there, out of the axon for every 2 potassium it pumps in. So if it's pumping more positives out than in, the inside is going to have less positives, so it's going to set up a negative potential, what's called the resting potential, which we can actually put little clamps on and measure in the neuron, that is negative 65 millivolts. So these sodium-potassium pumps are what set up our neuron so that it's ready to fire an electrical signal. Then we have these what are called voltage-gated sodium channels. And these voltage-gated sodium channels will open at a certain potential, which is called the activation potential. They open and allow sodium plus ions to flow down their concentration gradient. So we've set up this difference of concentrations, and now if we just open the gates, it flows naturally. At negative 40 millivolts. That's what we call the activation potential. If something causes the neuron to go from its resting potential of negative 65 millivolts to a negative 40 millivolts, all these voltage-gated sodium channels will open and sodium will rush in, causing an electrical current. So it's called the activation or threshold potential. So that starts the electrical signal flowing down the neuron. But if we can't close that gate and reestablish that potential, we will only be able to ever fire a neuron once. So then we have what are called voltage gated potassium channels. And these actually open and allow K plus ions to flow down their concentration gradient at approximately positive 40 millivolts. This is called the maximum potential. So we're going to draw a little picture here, and it's going to get a little bit messy, but we'll try and keep it organized. We're going to start out, we have our sodium-potassium pumps, and the sodium-potassium pumps work all of the time. They never stop working. Sometimes they just get overwhelmed by the channels. And they're always going to send, we're going to make this sodium, they're going to send 3Na plus out, while at the same time sending 2K plus in. Okay, so the ratio is always going to be way more sodium and way more positives on the outside, and more potassium but not overall more positives on the inside in a resting potential situation. So that action is what sets up the resting potential to be negative 65, because we have less positives on the inside of the cell, equals the resting potential. So I'm drawing right now inside the neuron. Okay. If a signal comes along that's received by the dendrite, that causes positive ions to flow in, such that we increase to negative 40 millivolts, we will reach what's called the threshold potential. When the threshold potential is reached, what happens is this voltage gated channel opens. So its lid essentially is closed. It changes its 3D shape depending on the membrane potential, and it opens up. So when it opens up, then all of a sudden we have this high concentration of sodium on the outside. It rushes in. Okay. So at negative 40 millivolts, that's the threshold potential. The sodium channels, which are voltage gated, open. And Na plus rushes into the neuron. The Na plus just naturally, according to the laws of diffusion, start to diffuse in every direction. causing the membrane potential around it to increase to -40, causing the next one to open. And so on and so forth, causing a chain reaction of channels opening and sodium rushing in down its concentration gradient. This chain reaction of positives rushing into the cell is what we know as the electrical current. Problem is, if this was all that happened, we would never be able to refire a neuron once that positive rushed in. That signal would last for a long time. We can actually essentially turn the signal off though, because over time, so the potassium channels open, and because we had potassium built up on the inside, the potassium will rush out of the channel. Okay, so we're just going to write this here. We're going to write it down here where there's a little more room. When Na plus rushes in, it causes a positive membrane potential. And at positive 40 millivolts, the K plus channels open, voltage gated, so when at positive 40 millivolts they change their shape and open up and allow K plus to rush out of the cell in an effort to start returning the cell back to its resting potential. And this happens as they diffuse along. This series goes along the axon membrane. Okay, so we can describe this in a little more detail. So that's a picture of how it happens in the membrane. Now we'll discuss it stepwise in detail. This process has several steps. The first is called the resting potential. This is when your neurons are at rest, not sending a signal. Now, there's some variance in what the resting potential is reported to be. We'll go with what your textbook says. It declares the resting potential is negative 65 millivolts. So, no electrical signal being sent. What is occurring at this point is the sodium plus and potassium plus pumps are actively transporting Na plus out of the cell and 2K plus into cell. This results in three things: a high concentration of sodium outside of cell, a high concentration of potassium, where? That's right, inside the cell. And 3, fewer positive ions in the cell, which equals our negative membrane potential, or PD. Now just take a second. If you want to think about the situation sort of the way we set up electricity in our province, basically we store a huge amount of potential kinetic energy behind a dam, a hydroelectric dam. All that water's sitting up high in a lake, and then we run that potential energy, we run that kinetic energy through the dam, we release it, it falls to the ground, and while it falls to the ground, it turns the turbine, which in turn creates an electrical charge. Here, what our cells have necessarily done is they've set up the situation where they're storing a whole bunch of sodium outside and a whole bunch of potassium inside, and then they just open the gates, let the ions flow. It takes a lot of work and energy to set up the difference, but once the difference is set up and you release it, it produces a flow of electricity very, very quickly. Theoretically, you could just use the pumps to create a current difference and have that occur, but because it's an active process, it takes more time and it wouldn't be as effective or as quick. So step one is to set up the resting potential. And the sodium-potassium pumps, once again, are working throughout all of these steps. We just don't concentrate on them in the second, third, fourth step. Okay? So in step two, this is called depolarization. We set up a polarity, a difference between one side of the cell and the other, and now we're going to change it, depolarization, or undo that difference. And depolarization starts at negative 40 millivolts and ends at positive 40 millivolts. It is part one of two-part action potential. Where the electrical signal is being sent along the axon. It's called the action potential because, hey, the action's happening, the electrical signal is occurring. So for it to begin, threshold potential must be met. And it's met by summing or integrating all incoming electrical signals. All incoming chemical signals. So that dendrite's receiving all sorts of chemical signals that are causing ion channels to open and close. And if the right combination of ion channels open, you get enough positives rushing in that you will reach that negative 40 millivolt threshold. And next day we'll talk about the nature of the chemical signals. At negative 40 millivolts, the voltage gated sodium channels open as we discussed above. and sodium rushes blank the cell. Which way is it going to go? Is it going to move in or out? Where was the higher concentration before this all started? That's right, we were kicking 3 out, so we were building up a high concentration outside. If we open the channels, it's now going to rush into the cell, down its concentration gradient. And those positives, the Na plus positives, will diffuse, causing further channels to open. In what we call the domino effect, or all or nothing response. Because once it starts, you can't pull it back. After that, we can't stay infinitely depolarized, or we wouldn't be able to send another signal. Fortunately, the next step is to repolarize, or repolarization. And this happens, it starts at positive 40 millivolts and actually undershoots or hyperpolarizes to, it should only go to negative 40, but it goes all the way to negative 65 millivolts. So how does it do this repolarization? Luckily, that's where the potassium comes in. So at 40 plus millivolts, the voltage gated Na plus channels close. While the voltage gated K plus channels open. So you've had all these positive ions, sodium ions, rushing down their concentration gradient, causing the inside of the cell to become positive. Now, if you open the K plus channels, what way is it going to flow? If you think, sodium-potassium channels were pumping 2 potassium in, so we built up a bunch of potassium on the inside. Now when we open the gate, it's going to rush out of the cell. So at plus 40 millivolts, the K plus rushes out of cell, down its concentration gradient. In fact, it rushes out so fast it overshoots, or undershoots we say, the resting membrane potential. Goes slightly below negative 65, which I should put up here to below negative 65, which then brings us to step 4, which is called the recovery. which occurs at negative 65 millivolts. So it's the return to resting potential. So what happens is, at negative 65 millivolts, the K plus channels close, and now the sodium-potassium pumps, which have been working all along, are no longer overwhelmed. And can reestablish the Na plus K plus concentration difference and the resting potential. So essentially they've been working all along, but it's kind of like those recent storms, maybe like Sandy. They're out there bailing in their basement with an ice cream bucket while the water's flowing in at a much faster rate. They just can't keep up. Even though they're working, they're not having an overall effect. Once you close all the gates, then they just continue working and eventually catch up and recreate that concentration difference. Okay. Now just a note here, up here we talked about repolarization is actually, I should have put in here, sorry, the second part of the action potential. So we can put it down here. What's called the action potential, when the signal is actually being sent. So electrical signal sent. Really involves the combined process of depolarization plus repolarization. So scientists are actually able to measure these differences in membrane potential and graph them, looking at real live neurons. So we're going to show you an example of what the graph might look like. It could be a neuron's getting a little bit of input, but it's not coming up to the threshold potential. But eventually it might receive a chemical signal that's strong enough to send it up to its threshold potential. Once it reaches its threshold potential, it's going to go all the way up to the maximum and then come back down, all the way back down, undershoot the resting potential before it returns back to the resting potential. Then again, it could have little blips going along here until it repeats the procedure. And what we're going to look at is what's happening at the various stages. So here is negative 65 millivolts, which equals resting potential. This is the negative 40 millivolts, which is the threshold. Once you reach threshold potential, the signal is going to be sent, all or nothing. And at the top, we have plus 40 millivolts, which is our maximum potential. So if you're feeling more pain, it's not that it's gone above plus 40, it's just that the neurons either firing more frequently or more neurons are firing together. So if we look at this, we can correlate this to the steps we discussed or described above. In this region here, I'm going to change to blue, this region from here to here, that would be number 1, the resting potential discussed above. From here to here, it's number 2, depolarization. So we'll write in resting below here. From here to here is repolarization. And if you consider 2 and 3 together, that's called your action potential, because that's where the electrical signal is actually being sent along the neuron. If you find some funny glitches in the editing here, it's because my program's getting overwhelmed and shutting down on me, and I'm having to restart my computer. So, action potential. And then finally, down here, we have 4. We have recovery. And what's happening along a neuron, if we look at this, I'm not going to repeat what the steps are, because we've talked about it on the previous page, but if you look along a neuron, dendrite down to axon terminal. If you actually graphed this going along the neuron, you would see it's a series of overlapping as each successive sodium channel followed by potassium channel opens. You'd see this traveling. Action potential after action potential, and they look identical. That was poor drawing on my part. And that would essentially be the electrical signal traveling along the neuron. Okay, so there's just one question, and that is, I've always shown the electrical signal traveling from dendrite to axon. But at one point I mentioned how when the sodium comes in, it can diffuse in three-dimensional space. It's going to diffuse in all directions. So why does the signal only travel forward when there's sodium channels on either side of this? Why can't it open the ones behind? And this is really important because we want the signal to travel in one direction in order to be able to send messages. If it goes both directions, it would be confusing to our body. And this is possible because of something called the refractory period. And the refractory period is a period of inactivation lasting approximately 1 millisecond, where a sodium channel cannot reopen after being closed. So once the membrane potential reaches positive 40 millivolts, causing the sodium channel to close, it can't immediately be reactivated or reopened. This allows or causes, results, might be the best choice, results in the electrical signal only carrying forward to channels that have yet to open. And because of this, we say that the electrical signal is unidirectional. It can only go forward. Uni for one direction, and that direction is forward. Okay. And just one more quick point of note. The other day we were talking about myelination of neurons. And this is the myelination, or myelinated neurons. And do you guys remember what we called these little gaps in between? They were the nodes of, I know it's on the tip of your tongue, starts with an R, Ranvier. Now, interesting thing, slatatory conduction is the idea of the electrical signal essentially jumping along the neuron axon at great speeds. Rather than traveling along the whole length, it actually jumps from node to node. Because it's at the nodes where the channels are localized. Now, I dislike this picture for one reason. It shows the potential sort of jumping along the outside. It actually jumps along the inside from one node to the next node to the next node. But those of you who play sports, you'll understand this concept. Your coach has probably told you, pass the ball, don't run with the ball, because the ball will move much faster if it jumps from player to player as opposed to if we physically run it from one player to the next. It's the same with the electrical signal. It'll move faster if it jumps from node to node than if we go through every single channel along the neuron. And because of this slatatory conduction, it allows the signal to travel at approximately 200 meters per second, or 720 kilometers per hour. So not only does myelination protect the neuron, it helps the signal travel faster. And that's the end of the electrical signal. If you have any questions, please come see me. Otherwise, have a great day, and I'll see you in class.